I'm Ethan Carter, 59 years old, retired from 35 years as a commercial electrical contractor, and I never imagined the quiet little house my late father left me would become the center of a fight that nearly shut down an entire neighborhood. Looking back now, people always ask me if I planned every step, if I somehow knew the ending before it happened. The truth is, I was just an old man trying to protect what belonged to my family, and the people who thought they could push me around made one mistake. They never bothered to check before crossing my fence. My place sits at the edge of a gated community outside Mesa, Arizona, though technically my property was there decades before the subdivision ever existed. My little ranch house isn't much to look at anymore. Faded, tan paint, an old mesquite tree leaning over the driveway, a porch swing my wife painted blue before cancer took her 7 years ago. The driveway has more cracks than smooth concrete. My pickup is old enough to vote, and my mailbox has probably survived more summers than half the people living behind those expensive gates. Meanwhile, every new house inside the community looks like it came straight from the same luxury catalog. Spotless stucco walls, oversized garages, perfectly trimmed desert landscaping, shiny SUVs lined up like showroom displays, and enough Tesla chargers to light up a football stadium. I never envied any of it. I liked my quiet mornings too much. Every sunrise, I'd carry a cup of coffee out back, check my vegetable garden, listen to the quail running through the brush, then spend an hour tinkering with whatever old project happened to be sitting in my garage. That routine kept me sane after my wife passed. The HOA never liked me much because I refused to repaint my house every 5 years just because somebody updated the community color palette. Didn't matter that my property wasn't governed by their rules. They still acted like my old ranch somehow ruined the view for everyone driving past the entrance. The biggest problem was their president, a man named Victor Langley. Victor wasn't loud. He didn't have to be. Guys like him smile while they're telling you what you're going to do. Mid-40s, perfect haircut, expensive polo shirts with the HOA logo stitched on the chest, always carrying a clipboard like it gave him legal authority over the entire county. Every conversation with him started politely and somehow ended with a threat wrapped inside a compliment. About 6 months before everything exploded, he stopped by while I was repairing one of my drip irrigation lines. He leaned on my fence, looked around my yard for a full minute, then smiled. "You know, Ethan, your irrigation system really looks outdated. If it ever causes drainage issues for the community, we'd have to step in." I wiped my hands on an old rag and looked at him. "Funny thing about that, Victor, it's been working just fine since before your clubhouse even had a foundation." His smile tightened just a little. "Standards change," I shrugged. "Property rights don't." He chuckled like I'd made a joke, tipped his sunglasses back down, and walked away. I remember watching him leave and thinking that wouldn't be the last conversation we'd have. I just didn't realize how soon it'd happen. 3 weeks later, I drove to Phoenix to help my daughter move some furniture into her new apartment. It took longer than expected, and I didn't get home until nearly 10 the next morning. The first thing I noticed was yellow caution tape stretched across my backyard. My stomach dropped before I even got out of the truck. Half my drip irrigation system had been ripped out of the ground. Plastic tubing lay scattered across the dirt like somebody had attacked it with a shovel. Several sprinkler heads were snapped clean off. The valve box beside my tool shed had been smashed open, its metal cover bent almost in half. Whoever did it hadn't accidentally damaged anything. They'd torn through it with confidence. Hanging from one of the broken pipes was a laminated notice: Community Landscape Compliance Inspection. Unauthorized irrigation equipment removed under HOA Environmental Standard 8.4. Signed, Victor Langley. I actually laughed for about 3 seconds because my brain refused to believe anyone could be that stupid. Then the anger settled in. Not the kind where you yell or throw things. The quiet kind that makes everything suddenly very clear. I walked over to the old steel access hatch hidden beneath a patch of decorative gravel near the back fence. Most people thought it covered an abandoned utility box. Even some longtime residents had no idea it was there. My father installed that access point in the mid-1980s after upgrading the property's deep groundwater system. And before he died, he stood right where I was standing and told me, "Son, one day somebody's going to forget where this neighborhood gets its water. When they do, don't argue with them, just remind them." At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. Standing there with broken irrigation lines at my feet and Victor's signature hanging from a destroyed pipe, I realized Dad hadn't been dramatic at all. He'd simply lived long enough to understand how quickly people confuse convenience with ownership. I brushed the dirt off the hatch, reached for the worn steel handle, and slowly lifted it open. The hatch creaked the same way it had when my father first showed it to me nearly 40 years earlier, and sitting beneath it was exactly what I expected. The original master control assembly feeding the production well that had quietly supplied this land long before luxury homes, clubhouse grand openings, and HOA newsletters ever existed. Most people assume neighborhoods get their water from the city, but this development had been built under a special agreement because the municipal infrastructure hadn't reached the side of the valley when construction began. Instead of drilling their own production well, the developer signed a renewable access contract with my father, who already owned a high-capacity agricultural well that had more than enough output for both our property and the future subdivision. It saved the developer a fortune back then. Over the years, the original board members retired. Companies changed hands. Paperwork disappeared into filing cabinets. Management firms rotated every few years. And eventually, the people running the HOA treated the water supply like it magically appeared underground all by itself. The only thing that never changed was the easement, the well, and the shutoff valve sitting right in front of me. I climbed down into the shallow concrete vault, ran my hand over the old brass wheel, and couldn't help smiling as memories came flooding back. Dad used to grease that valve every spring. "Machines only respect people who respect them," he'd always say. I grabbed the wrench hanging on the hook inside the vault, checked the pressure gauges one more time, then slowly closed the main control exactly as the maintenance procedure required whenever downstream equipment had potentially been compromised. I didn't damage anything. I didn't cut a pipe. I didn't threaten anybody. My irrigation system had just been destroyed during an unauthorized inspection, and before allowing thousands of gallons of water to continue flowing through infrastructure connected to my property, I was going to inspect every inch of it. That was simply common sense. I locked the hatch, carried my toolbox back into the garage, made myself another cup of coffee, and waited. It took less than 3 hours. Around 11 that morning, a siren echoed across the subdivision. Not loud enough to panic anyone, but persistent, a repeating electronic tone followed by an automated announcement about insufficient fire suppression pressure. I could hear it clearly from my backyard while trimming tomato plants. 30 seconds later, it repeated. Then again. Then again. By late afternoon, residents were wandering outside looking confused while maintenance workers sprinted between the clubhouse mechanical room and the decorative pump house beside the lake. I stayed exactly where I was. Around sunset, my neighbor Martha from across the county road walked over carrying fresh peach cobbler. She'd lived nearby almost as long as I had and knew more local history than anyone. She looked toward the subdivision entrance where emergency lights flashed in the distance and quietly asked, "You finally remind them?" I smiled without answering. She laughed before taking a bite of her own cobbler. "You daddy would have enjoyed this." The next morning, a White County Fire Department truck rolled through the gates. 2 inspectors spent nearly 4 hours testing hydrants, checking mechanical rooms, measuring pressure levels, and examining control panels. Around lunchtime, yellow notices started appearing on every public building. Residents gathered around reading them while talking over each other. Community fitness center closed until further notice. Clubhouse occupancy suspended. Event hall temporarily unsafe for public assembly due to inadequate fire suppression capability. By evening, social media exploded. Homeowners blamed management. Management blamed contractors. Contractors blamed equipment suppliers. Nobody blamed the one man whose property they had marched onto without permission. Around dinner time, Victor finally showed up. He didn't knock. He pounded on my front door like the house owed him money. I opened it halfway. His face was red. "Did you shut off the water?" he demanded. "I secured my equipment after somebody vandalized it," I answered calmly. "You can't do this." "Can't I? You're affecting 60 families." "Interesting choice of words," I replied. "Yesterday you affected one family and didn't seem too worried." He pointed toward my backyard. "Turn it back on immediately." I folded my arms. "Did your people have written permission to enter my property?" He hesitated. "We believed." "That's not what I asked." Silence. "Did anyone ask before destroying my irrigation?" Another silence. Finally, he sighed. "Mistakes were made." I nodded slowly. "Now we're making progress." He left without another word, but I knew that wasn't the end of it. Saturday morning, the real pressure arrived. Insurance representatives visited the community. Apparently, the carrier had strict requirements for continuous operational fire suppression systems. And without verified water pressure, the policy covering every common structure could be suspended. Once homeowners heard that, panic spread faster than wildfire. Mortgage companies require insurance. Without insurance, lenders start asking uncomfortable questions. People who had ignored me for years suddenly waved when driving past my house. One even stopped to ask whether I'd heard any rumors. I told him the same thing I'd told everyone else. I heard somebody broke my irrigation. By Monday afternoon, Victor returned, this time with the HOA attorney and a property management executive I'd never seen before. Their expensive black SUV rolled slowly into my driveway like they were arriving for peace negotiations. The attorney introduced himself first, extending a hand. "Mr. Carter, we'd like to discuss a resolution." "That's already an improvement," I replied. Last week, nobody wanted to discuss anything. We sat on my porch. No conference room, no polished table, just 3 folding chairs under an old ceiling fan that squeaked every few minutes. The attorney opened a folder filled with documents. "It appears there may have been administrative misunderstandings regarding the original water agreement." I couldn't help laughing. "Administrative misunderstandings? Your president trespassed onto private property and destroyed my equipment." Victor stared at the porch floor. The attorney continued carefully. "Would you be willing to restore service while negotiations continue?" "No." He blinked. "No? My system isn't certified safe after the damage your people caused. I'm not reopening anything until we're finished." He looked frustrated but stayed professional. "Then what exactly are you asking for?" I stood up, walked inside, and returned carrying a large manila envelope my daughter had helped me prepare the night before. I placed it on the table between us. "Everything I want is in there." The attorney removed the papers and started reading. His expression changed halfway through the first page. Then he read it again more slowly. "Market rate commercial water supply agreement. 15-year guaranteed contract. Annual service fee adjusted to current market value. Full reimbursement for all damaged irrigation equipment. Professional restoration of landscaping by a licensed contractor of my choosing. Written notice 72 hours before anyone entered my property for any reason. Financial penalties for future unauthorized access. Annual inspection conducted only with my approval." The attorney looked over at Victor. "Did you know about any of this?" Victor quietly shook his head. "No." I leaned back in my chair. "Your board spent years assuming generosity was the same thing as obligation. My father charged the original developer almost nothing because they respected him. Respect disappeared. So the price changed." Nobody spoke for nearly a full minute. The attorney finally closed the folder, looked directly at Victor, and whispered something too quietly for me to hear. Whatever he said drained every bit of confidence from Victor's face. He suddenly looked less like the man who had marched into my yard with authority, and more like someone realizing he'd just stepped into a hole he never saw coming. Victor came back the following Thursday, but this time there was no expensive smile, no clipboard tucked under his arm, no quiet confidence that everyone would simply fall in line. He looked exhausted, like he hadn't slept more than a couple of hours all week. Behind him stood the same attorney, a restoration contractor, and the community's new property management director, a woman who introduced herself before anyone else had the chance. "Mr. Carter," she said, extending her hand. Before we discuss paperwork, I'd like to apologize. What happened on your property should never have happened. I looked at Victor. He still hadn't said a word. Finally, after what felt like forever, he cleared his throat. I made assumptions, he admitted. I thought because the neighborhood depended on the system, the HOA had authority over it. I never reviewed the original agreements. I nodded slowly. No, you just walked onto someone else's land because you thought wearing a title made you right. He didn't argue. That was the first moment I realized he finally understood the difference between power and responsibility. The attorney slid a thick folder across my porch table. Every condition I'd requested had been accepted, and then some. The annual water agreement wasn't $48,000 anymore. Their own consultant had determined that comparable commercial supply contracts were worth considerably more. So, the final figure came in just over $54,000 per year, prepaid every January. My damaged irrigation system would be rebuilt from scratch with upgraded equipment instead of patched together. Every broken valve, every ruined sprinkler head, every inch of tubing would be replaced. They even agreed to landscape the entire backyard afterward because heavy equipment had torn up sections of my garden during the unauthorized inspection. Then came the part that surprised me. The new management director pushed another sheet toward me. The board voted unanimously to adopt a new property access policy, she explained. No employee, contractor, or board member will enter private property without written authorization unless there's an immediate life-threatening emergency. We felt your situation exposed a larger problem. I couldn't help smiling. Looks like somebody finally read the law. Victor gave a tired little laugh. Honestly, we should have done that before we ever read the HOA handbook. We all signed the paperwork that afternoon. I walked back to the old access hatch with 4 people watching from a respectful distance. The attorney asked quietly, "Would you mind if we observed?" "Not at all," I answered. Might as well see what everyone's been arguing about. I unlocked the steel cover, climbed down into the vault one last time, checked every gauge, inspected every fitting, and slowly turned the brass wheel back to its original position. You could actually hear the pressure equalizing through the line. It wasn't dramatic. No explosions, no cheering crowds, just the quiet sound of water returning to where it had always belonged. About 20 minutes later, the emergency alarms inside the subdivision stopped. The silence almost felt strange after hearing those warning tones echo across the neighborhood for nearly a week. The next morning, county inspectors returned for another full inspection. This time, every hydrant passed. Pressure levels were restored. Fire suppression systems tested perfectly. By Tuesday afternoon, the yellow notices disappeared from the clubhouse doors. The fitness center reopened. Weekend events were rescheduled, and life inside the gates slowly returned to normal. A week later, I was out front repainting my old mailbox when several homeowners I'd barely spoken to over the years started stopping by. Some brought cookies. One family dropped off homemade salsa. An older couple apologized because they'd believed the rumors before learning what had actually happened. One man looked almost embarrassed when he said, "I honestly thought you were trying to punish the whole neighborhood." I shook my head. No, I was protecting my property. The neighborhood got caught in the consequences of someone else's decisions. He stood there quietly for a second before saying, "Fair enough." Funny thing is, I never hated the people living behind those gates. Most of them had no idea how the community had been built or who had quietly kept things running all those years. They simply trusted the people they'd elected to make good decisions. Unfortunately, titles don't magically create wisdom. Sometimes they just give overconfident people permission to stop asking questions. A month later, I noticed something that made me laugh every single time. Anytime an HOA contractor needed to access anything near my property, I'd receive a polite email several days in advance asking for permission. They'd include maps, work schedules, estimated arrival times, even the names of every worker who'd be present. I'd usually reply with one sentence: "Approved. Thanks for asking." That's all I'd wanted from the beginning. Respect costs a whole lot less than arrogance. My father used to tell me that ownership isn't proven by how loudly you claim something. It's proven by the responsibilities you're willing to carry when everyone else forgets. For decades, our family quietly supplied water because it was the neighborly thing to do. We never demanded recognition. We never asked for applause. But the moment someone confused kindness with weakness, they forced me to remind them exactly where the line had always been. Looking back now, I don't feel proud because I won. I feel relieved because the lesson didn't cost anyone their home, their safety, or their lives. It only cost a few egos and a very expensive contract that should have been fair from the very beginning. So, now I'm curious. Do you think I went too far by shutting down the water until my property rights were respected? Or do you believe the HOA crossed the line the moment they stepped onto private land and destroyed someone else's equipment? If you've ever dealt with an HOA, difficult neighbors, or people who thought authority gave them permission to ignore basic respect, I'd really like to hear your story. Share your experience down in the comments, because sometimes the best lessons don't come from winning an argument. They come from hearing how someone else fought for what was right.